Imagine joining a game of Monopoly, and the bank tells you that in order for you to win, you have to get a loan with 10% interest. So you do. You want to win, right? Everybody wants to win. So you roll, and you land on a property that isn't yours. But you haven't got the money to pay for it, so you get a loan. Roll, get another loan, repeat. Roll, get another loan, repeat. And by the time you've taken a lap around the board, you realize that you've been swindled. In real life, there is no second lap. You get one chance and that's it. So the 10% loan in question is a student loan. So you want to go down the safe path, right? So you go to school, get good grades, go to a good uni, and thanks to your student loan, you're actually able to go to uni because obviously it costs 10,000 a year. And then from there, you can get a high paying job. However, for the vast majority of you, this is simply no longer the case. A more realistic outlook is getting 60,000 in debt in student loans, only to then get a 30, max 40k paying job. And something that you must not forget is that interest compounds from the very second of your first day. So the second you step foot in that campus, interest starts piling up at 10% a year. Now, let's just calculate this very, very quickly. If your loan is 10,000 for the first 1 year, how much interest do you accrue during that time period? That's right. Simply from interest, you're already on 11,000. So 1,000 is added onto that 10,000 after your first year. And this isn't even taking into account maintenance loans or anything like that. And not to mention the fact that you have no guaranteed job at the end. So your interest is increasing, compounding, your nominal sum is increasing, and you have no job at the end. Now, it is true that you only have to pay 9% over 25k, but if you're on zero, well, I'd imagine you're quite stressed. And the phrasing they have to manipulate you, quite frankly, is genius. So they frame this as you're investing in yourself. And who doesn't want to invest in themselves, right? You want to better your life. You want to improve yourself. And as this was sold, the Safe Path was sold as a way for guaranteed upwards mobility, you'd think to yourself, I'd be a fool not to do this. However, as I already mentioned, unfortunately for most people, this is not the case. Something I'd like to mention as well is the fact that you cannot wipe this away in bankruptcy. Now, it is true that after 30 or 40 years, it will go down to zero, but during that time, you'll still have to pay a monthly amount. And actually, the purpose of this, as I've written here, is to have an additional tax. But we'll come back to that in a second. And the final thing I want you to remember, just to highlight how absurd this whole thing is that when you're 18, you can't get a loan for anything. You can't get a loan for starting up a business, getting a mortgage, or anything like that. The only loan you can get is a student loan. Now, if that does not scream monopoly, I don't know what does. And as I already mentioned here, the true purpose of student loans is not to enrich you, it's not to improve your life, but it's to act as an additional tax. And when people are financially squeezed, they're much easier to control. Not to mention the fact that bankers make a lot of money from the fact that you get these loans, which, frankly speaking, you just get a piece of paper that you'll never use. I know so many people, it's honestly insane, that graduate really good degrees as well. For example, becoming a lawyer, and then they end up in a HR department. Unfortunately, this is the way the country is heading. Like, jobs are becoming more and more scarce, and it's becoming more and more so that you need connections just to get a decent job. And let me highlight the most absurd thing about these student loans. The fact that this is presented as a favor by the government. Now, why is this so crazy? Because 30 years ago, university was free. Free, right? Completely free. And in fact, some people could get scholarships where they'll get paid to go to university. Whereas contrast this with now, everyone can go to uni. Why? Because of available free money. You can just sign up and get a loan and off you go to university, right? And some universities, they don't even have high requirements, so they can genuinely accept anyone. In fact, let me tell you this story. So in school, we used to have this daily briefing, basically your daily dose of propaganda. And towards the end of the session, someone asked one of the teachers something about how they could fund their student accommodation, their life. And teacher said, don't worry about that. You can actually get a maintenance loan. You can get another 10,000 to survive. And obviously, the guy was quite happy with that because he thought that that was completely fine. He thought that's free money. But no, obviously you're going to have to pay that back at some point. And even though you pay a small amount every month, it may look small relative to your annual salary, but you must look at your monthly expenses. Your monthly expenses, especially if you're living in the capital city of any Western country, will be extremely high. So the additional burden of, as crazy as it seems, maybe 300 or 400 a month, you'll definitely feel that. And the most absurd thing about this whole story is obviously the fact that school taught us that debt is fine, whereas debt is one of the worst things that can happen to a human. So let's go through what is debt. So, debt. What is debt? Well, it's the money you borrow with the promise to pay back, and usually you pay it back with interest, and interest is the part that gets most people. And one of the worst types of debt that exploit these interest rates is consumer debt. So let's cover this now. So consumer debt, one of the worst types of debt that you can get into. So the first thing I want you to remember is that buy now, pay later is truly one of the worst debts that you can get into. Let's have a look as to why. So the first thing is that it encourages spending. So even though you may pay the same amount, so for example, an item may cost $200 and it may be $50 over 4 months. That alleviates the pain and the stress of actually paying $200 at once. It makes it seem cheaper than it actually is, and it entices you into spending that money. Whereas if that option didn't exist, you may be more reserved and you may think to yourself that actually, I can pass this time. So as I mentioned, it lowers the pain of spending. Another thing is that it's very easy to stack by accident, and this will cause you huge stress, as if you have loads of different loans that you have to keep paying back, inevitably the stress will compound, but also the fact that you have to rely on the next paycheck even more will drive you insane. So make sure that if you do happen to have any of these buy now pay later schemes, that you keep them under control and you know how many you have at the moment, and try to reduce them, ideally get them to zero as soon as possible. If you're in a financial situation to do so, of course. That's just my personal advice, but not financial advice. Another thing is that minimum payments are not a way to pay off debt. They're designed in a way to service it indefinitely, and the lender designed it that way. So, what do I actually mean by this? Well, I'll give you an example. I've written it down here. So, imagine you have a $5,000 credit card at a 20% APR interest rate. If you keep paying only the minimum payments, that would take you 15 to 20 years. And this is only one credit card, by the way. So imagine if you have a few. Your whole life would pass by and you still will not have paid off the debt. And the most concerning thing is that this only goes to paying off the interest as a whole, rather than the balance itself. So you're just paying off the interest rather than decreasing the balance, as I've written here. Another thing that is very detrimental with consumer debt is keeping up with the Joneses. So what that actually means is basically if your next door neighbor buys a new Mercedes, you go and buy a new Mercedes. If your neighbor goes on holiday, what are you going to do? Of course, you're going to go on holiday too. Why? So that you don't feel left behind. This is really just FOMO, fear of missing out. But advertisers manipulate you in such a way that you really do just feel FOMO and that you're being left behind. So you almost force yourself to just spend more than you actually have. So a key lesson that I'd like to leave you with here today is spend below your means. So spend less than what you actually earn. Sounds very simple, but a lot of people do truly struggle with this. Appearing rich is different to actually being rich. Which one do you want to be? And these two final points go hand in hand. So materialism and the treadmill effect. So the first thing that I'll start with is materialism. So materialism leads to this hedonic spiral where it's never enough. You know, first you'll buy a car. an old car, for example, and you're like, oh, it sucks now. So you buy a newer car, a newer car, a newer car. And even though this is on finance, you're like, oh, it's only, say, 100 more a month. And then you start buying new clothes, for example, this suit, and then you're like, oh, it's only £400. Then you're like, oh, I'll get one for £800. Then I'll get one for £1,200. And slowly you just keep going down this spiral, right? And then what happens is you're just living paycheck to paycheck. Now, the reason why this is such a problem is because your stress will be through the roof. And imagine for whatever reason you're made redundant, or suddenly what happens? You still got the bills to pay, but you don't have the money coming in. So that's why you have to be really, really careful with this. And people that love to prey on people like this are loan sharks. So let's cover this right now. So, loan sharks, who are they and what do they do? So they're legal money lenders, usually with extraordinary interest rates. So for example, 100%, 200%, even 1,000% is possible with them. So let's compare loan sharks with legal bodies, for example, payday loans. So loan sharks, illegal. Payday loans, legal. Loan sharks, there is no credit check, okay? So they can literally trap anyone. So even if you're the poorest guy on the planet, they can still trap you. Whereas with payday loans, they actually conduct mandatory credit checks. And the other thing with loan sharks is their collection tactics are literally threats and violence. So they'll beat you up. In extreme cases, it can go further than that. Whereas payday loans, there are strict consumer protection laws. And loan sharks, there is no formal paperwork or tracing, obviously, because they want to be unknown to the authorities. Whereas payday loans are transparent and have real, professionally written contracts. And now what I'm going to touch upon is why you should avoid loans, specifically loans with high interest rates, as I believe it's fitting to this. So, why should you avoid loans, especially with ones that have high interest rates? Well, first and foremost, this works against you. It's the opposite of building wealth. What you want to do is to become wealthy, right? So by getting loans, you're distancing yourself away from that destination. Secondly, it shrinks your options. So what do I actually mean by this? Well, it just means that you have less freedom to choose. I'll give you a brilliant example. So say that you don't want to do a certain type of job. Well, if you have a loan, especially one with a high interest rate, and you have nothing else to do, as in you have no other options, you're forced to take that job, even if you don't like it. Why? Well, because the bills are due. That is a perfect example of having less freedom. Moreover, they are made very hard to escape. And the minimum payments especially are made to rinse you, as I already covered. For example, with that credit card example, I'll just recap it here once again. If you have a $5,000 credit card with a 20% APR, if you're just paying the minimum payments, that may take 15 to 20 years to pay off. 15 to 20 years. And this ties in perfectly with the last point, which is that you pay multiples of what you own. So your sum may have been 5,000, but you may end up paying 20,000 over the course of those years. And I think this perfectly leads us into our next slide, which is why debt is slavery. So, why is debt slavery? There are two main reasons. The first reason, loss of control over your own time and labor. So, you're forced to do things. So, for example, you may be forced to plow the field for free in order to pay back your debt. Obviously, this is more relatable if you're in a village. And also, in relation to your time, you have to use your time to do things that you don't want to do. And this leads us perfectly to the next point, reduced freedom of choice, which is exactly what I mentioned in the prior slide. Because you may not want to do something, but you're forced into doing it. And this then leads us into why debt truly is slavery, and it's because it's the opposite of wealth. So, what does it actually mean to be wealthy? Is it to wear a suit? Well, no, because if I can't meet my friends when I want, how I want, and where I want, that means nothing. Being wealthy means that you have time freedom, location freedom, and financial freedom. And the key skill that you need to learn is what good debt is and what bad debt is. So let's go through my principles now. So, what are my principles for debt? I have two. Let's go through the first one. does this asset appreciate or produce income, or does it depreciate slash get consumed? And my second principle, arguably is more important, is the interest lower or higher than what money could otherwise earn or than inflation? So simply put, is the current interest rate, so if you put your money in the bank, will you get more money than if you put it elsewhere? For example, in US treasuries, in other government bonds. And is their interest rate higher or lower than inflation? Those are the two things you need to bear in mind. Because if the interest rate is lower than inflation, what that actually means is that you're getting cheap money, because the money is going to be worth less in the future. So, if it passes both, it is worth considering. If it fails both, I personally would definitely avoid. And now let's go through some examples of good debt versus bad debt. So now, let's go through good debt versus bad debt, because not all debt is equal. And before we get into it, I just want to say a massive congratulations on getting this far into the video, because what you've learned this video will put you ahead of the 99% that don't know this. So back to good debt versus bad debt. Good debt. So as I already mentioned, low interest rate debt is actually good debt. The reason being is, and I must disclaim that this is only true if you're using it for logical purposes, not funding your lifestyle, for example, but using it in a way that will actually generate you more income in the future, or invest in an asset that will appreciate over time. So, low interest rate debt. Why is that good? Well, as I already mentioned, because in the future, that money will actually be cheaper than it is now due to inflation. Secondly, business loans to produce more income. So, if you're thinking of starting a business and you need a loan to get things going that will actually produce you more income, that's a good loan. Another good loan is obviously if you actually have a business and you're trying to expand, you need machinery, you need inventory just to expand, right? That's another good loan, because that will actually increase the amount of money that you can make in the future. Also, mortgage, I've written with a question mark, because up until this point, for the past, say, 30 years, getting a mortgage was actually a good investment. However, the housing Ponzi scheme will inevitably collapse, and that's why I put a question mark, because that's a risk that I personally would not be willing to take, in the sense that if I got a mortgage just to use it as an investment tool, I personally don't think that's a good long-term investment. However, historically, saying the last 30 years, that definitely delivered a handsome return. And a final piece of good debt that I've written here is student loans, believe it or not, but not in the way that you might think. Student loans that actually get you a good degree that will increase the amount of money you earn. So for example, if you can get a degree and then you can go into, say, a quant where you do trading there and you're earning 100, 200, 300k, obviously that's worth it. But if you're getting a psychology degree where you're going to earn 30k at the end of it, if you're lucky to get a job, that's not worth it. And that leads us on to bad debt. So as I've already mentioned a few times throughout this video, credit card debt is some of the worst debt that you can have. Because, especially if you're paying minimum payments, that will just rinse you dry. And this relates somewhat with car loans, because car loans, people get car loans so that they can drive a new car. But for the vast majority of people, they get the car loan so that they can show off their car in front of their friends, or to show off in front of strangers, which is incredibly stupid in my opinion, because ultimately, who are you getting the car for? For someone else or for yourself? I mean, if I get a car, it's for myself, right? And this ties in as well with buy now, pay later, where because of the fact that, for example, car loans through financing, you're paying small monthly fees, it doesn't feel that bad. For example, you're not paying 20k, 30k, 40k, 50k at once. You're paying, for example, a £5,000 deposit and then paying £300 a month or £400 a month. That is a much lighter load to bear than paying 50k upfront, right? And buy now, pay later as well is made to rinse you dry. As is the case with credit card debt, but we already covered this earlier, so I won't touch upon it too much. And payday loans, even though that they are better than getting a loan from a loan shark, they are essentially predatory as well because they have obscenely high interest rates. And this really should just be if you're extremely desperate in a last resort. But even then, you should ask family or friends. They won't charge you for example, 100% interest rate, which would just crush you. To summarize the bad debt section, in short, lifestyle debt is just obscenely stupid and you should never do it. Because ultimately, if you can't actually afford to live that lifestyle, you're not reaping any of the benefits. For example, if you can't afford to buy an S-Class, why on earth would you finance an S-Class and then you have to live paycheck to paycheck to paycheck, stressing? The guy who actually owns an S-Class is chilling. He's completely calm and he has plenty of money so that he doesn't have to worry about the 100k. So, what I want to leave you in closing is that good debt buys something that pays you back over time, whereas bad debt buys something that's already gone by the time the bill arrives. And in the next class, what I'm going to cover are taxes, something that I really wish I was taught when I was younger. But hopefully I can spare you the suffering and teach you exactly what you need to know. If you have any questions, as always, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you for watching. I hope that you got some real value from this.